Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Isabel Fry. I am the Director of Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, and I would like to just recognize everybody that we have at this webinar. It is a joint webinar between ASSAf, the Academy of Science of South Africa, and Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, and of course with the support of the Department of Science and Innovation. I am going to hand over to Professor Himla Sudyal, who is the Executive Officer of ASSAf, to officially open, and I will be back with a slightly longer, but not too long, I promise, introduction after Professor Julian May. And at that stage, I will also welcome and introduce the speakers. And it's seldom that I start a webinar with all the speakers already online and aboard, so to speak. So thank you very much. And Himla, over to you.
Thank you, Isabel. Good afternoon, colleagues. For some reason, Nadia, I'm not given access for my video. So it's not that I don't want to show my face, I don't have access. Colleagues, this is really an important opportunity for the Academy in partnership with the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute to co-host this event. We have a standing committee for the reduction of poverty and inequality that is chaired by Professor Julian May, who will speak next. And over the past year, through a kind of recommendation from our council, I had communicated to Julian and his team, the committee, that council was quite anxious for the Academy to get involved in looking at the issue of poverty and inequality, given the fact that we had already come out of our post-apartheid era of over 25 years, and that we were still seeing the problems linked with poverty and inequality. And of course, last year with the COVID pandemic, the situation got a bit worse. However, this particular committee under the directorship or chairpersonship of Professor Julian May have been engaging prior to this request from council on this topic. And from that was born the idea of a webinar series, which is what we are kicking off today. So without too much more from me, I just want to officially welcome you all to this particular event. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm sure it's going to live up to the expectations of the wait for it to have started. And I'm pleased to see that the number of participants are growing, and we look forward to the engagement going forward. So thank you, Isabel, and I will chat at the end again. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Himla. I'm going to ask Professor Julian May just to introduce a bit more of the substantive aspect of the objectives of this webinar series in his capacity as chair of the Standing Committee on Science for the Reduction of Poverty and Inequality. It has an incredibly awful acronym, so I won't even try. But Julian, if I can hand over to you.
Thanks, thanks very much, Isabel. This webinar series was prompted by our Standing Committee on Science for Poverty Reduction. We were reacting to the fact that South Africa has done well in its response to slowing the spread of COVID-19, as well as the mortality that could potentially have followed from infection. The situation currently unfolding in India gives us some sense of what could have happened. However, evidence is emerging that the success in dealing with the medical issues of COVID has come at considerable cost to livelihoods and well-being, and that this has disproportionately affected the most vulnerable, especially women and people living in precarious communities. We are seeing extreme hunger and outright desperation. This cannot continue, morally, politically, or from any other perspective. The resilience and patience of those most affected is running out, and their prospects of recovery are becoming increasingly slender. We must do something now to directly mitigate extreme poverty. We need to find a way to pay for this, and we need to ensure that all stakeholders are capable of implementing the strategies that we come up with. This webinar series is a contribution to finding a solution and to turning South Africa's considerable expertise in the measurement of poverty, the understanding of its causes, and the understanding of its dynamics into a societal impact. The webinar series was conceptualized by members of the ASSAf Standing Committee on Science for the Reduction of Poverty and Inequality. It has been implemented as a collaboration between ASSAf and other stakeholders concerned with the reduction and ultimately the elimination of poverty. Today, the collaborating partner is the Studies for Poverty and Inequality Institute, and the co-host who welcomed you is Ms. Isabel Fryer, who serves in our standing committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. I was just smiling at that because there was a time when I would introduce you as being a member of the SPI board. So we seem to have like swapped around there. Thanks. It's a great honor for us at SPI, Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, to have this opportunity. Just before I go into a few housekeeping rules, I just want to extend my thanks not only to ASSAf, but particularly to Nadia, who was undertaking from ASSAf's perspective most of the work, Hannah Atkins from SPI, and Henriette and Renat from ASSAf. So thank you. Thank you also to everyone who has signed in and is registered as participants. And I also just want to advise that we are also being streamed on Facebook. So we've been overwhelmed by the interest in this conversation, and for me, I'm really pleased that other people are seeing the importance of the data that's going to be presented here. So I also just want to advise that by registering and being part of this webinar, you have given consent to the recording. We will keep our cameras off as participants. But comments can be typed in the chat box. There is a time for question and answer, which I'll go through now quickly, just in terms of the program. And we would request that you type your questions in the questions and answer box, and keep the chat box just for any significant links or information that you think will be of interest to attendees. It won't be remarked on, however, by the participants or the panelists, should I say. Please put your hand up during the discussion session, but remember to take it down, and all presentations that have been prepared and the recording will be linked, will be available to anybody after the session. I believe you might have to actually complete an evaluation form as a price for that, but we would really urge you to access this going forward. So just very briefly, SPI is a not-for-profit research organization. We were established 15 years ago with a desire to provide research to human rights organizations and campaigns, which up until that point hadn't been so available. We work at NEDLAC for community constituency and are involved both at a policy level as well as community research. So as our name suggests, when we were established, the questions of poverty and inequality were, we didn't think were necessarily receiving the kinds of magnitude in terms of data and research, and certainly not within the popular domain. So a lot of the academics were involved in background research, but it wasn't coming into the policy. And we were very pleased that government at a certain stage warmly embraced the idea of empirical evidence for policy development. And really today's discussion is our attempt to provide some of that data into some discussions which do get quite heated sometimes. And that is the background information and discussion that hangs around the ability of social grants to address the crippling levels of poverty that we find ourselves in South Africa, and possibly with the fiscal policy to act as an equalizer in terms of redistribution to address the unsustainable levels of inequality. As Julian spoke about earlier, and Himmler as well, the most recent advent of COVID-19 crisis struck many households and devastated more of the informal income strategies that had been pursued. It was amazing to see the speed with which academics volunteered themselves and coordinated themselves into the NIDS CRAM multi-institutional cohort of researchers, trying to make sure that the evidence on the ground was both being recorded but was also being analysed and fed into recommendations in real time. And for those of us not directly involved, it has just been an incredible resource for us, and I salute people involved in that. And we know that as the social grants were phased in and out, I think more than any other opportunity, this has been available to note the direct impact of social grants. The broader discussion of a basic income grant, looking more at a universal transfer of cash transfers, is something which is being seized, that many people are being seized with at a policy level. NEDLAC is just concluding its own research into that. I know the Department of Social Development is about to launch a green paper, which includes comprehensive social security back to the days of the Taylor Report. And so on the one hand, we're going to, we're fortunate, incredibly fortunate to have Reza Daniels to speak to us on that. He's an associate professor with the School of Economics at UCT. Reza is also a research associate with the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit, also known as SALDRU at UCT School of Economics. Reza was previously a principal investigator of the NIDS, which is the National Income Dynamics Study, and is now also a principal investigator of the NIDS CRAM. So he'll be presenting immediately following my introduction and welcome now. And he'll then be followed by Grace Bridgman, who is at Stellenbosch University and has also been part of the NIDS CRAM research panel. She will be giving just a very short and sharp insight into the direct impact of the aspect of hunger and how that's been addressed. And we are then exceedingly fortunate to have Shireen Matala, who is Chief Research Manager at the Inclusive Economic Development Program of HSRC. Shireen is the head of the Impact and Research Development Portfolio, and her experience of public employment programs spans a period of more than 9 years. And it's her direct involvement in impact evaluations of EPWP, including KZN, that has spurred us to invite her to come and give her insight based from the data that she's been involved in terms of collecting and evaluating as to the role of EPWP in addressing poverty. Frequently in the past, public works has been juxtaposed to social grants as a form of social protection. And it seems to us that those days are certainly over, and we're wanting to learn from empirical evidence as to what the most fitting and necessary interventions would be to stem the immediate poverty levels as we start trying to rebuild our society. So without further ado, I am going to ask Reza to join us. Brilliant.
Excellent.
Thanks, Reza. So I'll give you a little nudge 15 minutes into your 20 minutes time.
Okay, that'll be perfect. Thanks so much, Isabel. And thanks for the opportunity to present today in what is clearly one of the most important questions in South Africa at the moment, which is what to do to reduce poverty and inequality. I'm going to focus on the results of a survey called the National Income Dynamics Study, Coronavirus Rapid Mobile Survey, which is a survey that we've run since about March 2020, that was designed to track the impact of the coronavirus lockdowns and how our society was responding to it on a nationally representative sample of South Africans. So what I'm going to focus on today is what we can learn about poverty and inequality from the NIDS-CRAM. I'll focus on some selected results around employment, grants, education, and then I believe Grace will talk a little bit about hunger, which is also something we focused on in the survey, so I won't focus on that. And I'll speak a little bit about what that then gives us as a community of scholars and individuals, what that gives us in terms of information to understand poverty and inequality. And then lastly, I'll focus just have a few points to say about what does that provide us with in terms of the clues to address poverty and inequality. And we'll have a bigger discussion about that in the course of this webinar. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that and rather participate in that discussion as we go along. Okay, so just to recap on what NIDS-CRAM is, it's a longitudinal survey, which is based on the National Income Dynamics Survey as a sampling frame. Now, NIDS was a panel study that was conducted between 2008 and 2017. And it was a face-to-face household income study, and we went to about roughly 28,000 individuals in 2008, and we followed them every 2 years subsequently. When NIDS-CRAM came about, we used the NIDS sample as a sampling frame, and we basically took a subsample of that because we had to change from a face-to-face survey to a telephonic survey. And the reason we had to do that is because of lockdown level 5, which prevented us, as we all know, from leaving our homes and clearly prevented field work to be done in terms of face-to-face survey. So we switched the mode of survey to be telephonic. We had the telephones of all of the sample of NIDS, and that's how we drew our first sample of individuals, which was called NIDS-CRAM Wave 1. If you want to understand anything about the survey, it is available online free of charge to anyone who wants to use the data or read the research. The panel user manual, which is a manual that we publish with each wave of NIDS-CRAM, and it always updates you with respect to the size of the sample, whether we are topping up that sample or not, etc. So as we have progressed inside of NIDS-CRAM, our sample started with 7,073 adults in wave 1. It reduced to about 5,676 in wave 2. We then topped up our wave 3 sample with an additional 1,084 individuals to have a total sample size of 6,130. Wave 4 of NIDS-CRAM is going to be released on Wednesday this week, and the invites have gone out. It's a free webinar that anyone can attend, and please do email me if you would like an invitation. And then lastly, Wave 5 will be released in July, and that will focus on April and May of 2021 and what's happening to this sample of individuals. So we follow them over time. We ask the same individuals questions about their employment status, about whether they're recipients of grants, about their health, their mental health, and their physical health. So it's a very powerful study from that point of view, because we also then look at what happened to education and early childhood development. Now, what we're going to focus on a little bit is just what's happened to South Africa over the course of 2020. And if we take the NIDS-CRAM survey on employment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare that to what we know about GDP, gross domestic product, which is measured by the South African Reserve Bank. I'm then going to look at 2 surveys from Statistics South Africa, which is the quarterly employment survey and the quarterly labor force survey. And then I'm going to look at NIDS-CRAM. So if we look at what happened to GDP over the course of 2020, we'll see that basically in the first quarter, if we index all of our numbers to 100 and begin in quarter one, we see that value added index dropped from 100 to 88. And that means value added index dropped by 12%. So that was the impact of level 5 of lockdown, right? And it basically meant that our total output in the economy shrunk by about 12%. It then increased in the third quarter to about 101.4, so 1.4% relative to Q1, and then increased again to 6.3% in the fourth quarter. Now, the similar trends happened in wages. If you look at wages unadjusted for inflation, it increased to around about 8.1% by the end of Q4 relative to that base year. But the key thing that we have to understand is what happened in Q2, because that was lockdown level 5, right? Q2 began, April that is, with lockdown level 5. By June, which was the end of Q2, we were in lockdown level 3. In Q3, we went to lockdown level 1 in October, but right at the end of Q4, we got to lockdown level 3 again. So the importance of this data is it shows us how our response to COVID through the lockdowns have impacted upon our economy. The big jumps in employment you can see in both Stats SA's surveys. In our second quarter, we saw a big reduction in actual employment. Formal employment in the QS was down by about 7%, whereas in the QLFS it was down 14%. In NIDS-CRAM, we also saw a reduction of about 14%. Sorry, we saw a reduction that was larger of about 16.5%. And then we saw a recovery by the fourth quarter, October, that is, to about 99%, where Stats SA didn't really see the same level of recovery. So there was some debate about were we getting the right employment numbers inside of NIDS-CRAM, and we've written a lot about the comparative estimates between them. The long and short of all this is that what we know from NIDS-CRAM is that poverty almost certainly increased. It's not best measured by NIDS-CRAM because we've got good earnings data, but our household per capita income data has a lot of missing observations. And relative to NIDS, it also has high measurement error. Because we had to shift to a telephonic survey to a face-to-face survey, so NIDS was face-to-face, NIDS-CRAM was telephonic, we didn't have the same ability to assess household income, and therefore we don't think our income data, if we look at household per capita income, is the best measurements to look at poverty. So Stats SA's data is much better there. In terms of inequality, though, we were able to assess what was happening to several measures of welfare, including what was happening spatially, so between cities and rural areas. We were able to look at inequality of education because we have public schools and private schools, and we can see what's happening to school feeding schemes and whether kids are able to access those. And we're able to look at health inequality as well. And then lastly, of course, we're able to look at grants in a lot of detail. So we did see that inequality increased in almost every dimension. And this is just because of the dramatic effects of the lockdown, not only in terms of class, but also spatially and in terms of education. Those kids in private schools have continued to get online education. Those kids in public schools have lost out tremendously, both in terms of their education, but also in terms of their school feeding schemes and access to regular meals. If they weren't attending schools, they weren't getting those regular meals. And as a consequence, the diet of children has been negatively affected by that. So our country has been in a profound sense of adjustment as COVID has increased and as our response as a community, as government and the community has continued to evolve. The one crucial aspect of 2020 that defines our response to COVID is the increasing rollout of social grants. And we'll look at a number of these dimensions in the data today. Okay, so what's very important about this graph on my right is that we have, it shows us the percentage of adults that receive a grant in their household, and it looks at that by age, by sex, by household income, and by location and occupation. I'm going to focus specifically on what happened at the overall level, because I think what was a tremendously successful aspect of our grant rollouts in the course of 2020 is the fact that 70% of adults received a grant in their household. And you can see here we're looking at all grants. So whether it's the child support grant, the social release of distress grant, or any other support grant, having access to both of the COVID grants or any other grant. And we're splitting the data here by recipiency of grants. The other thing that was really important is that about 2/3 of all of these individuals receive a CSG and SRD in the household. So these were particularly well targeted. As we know, the immediate response to COVID under the level 5 lockdown was to top up the CSG, and that's because it was already in operation, it was already reaching the vulnerable group, and therefore the recommendation at already in April was that the Treasury should increase that CSG. As we moved and evolved over time, more grants were added, and these grants became very well targeted, which meant that they were also highly progressive. So when we say a grant is progressive, we mean it's targeting the right group. In this instance, it's targeting poorer people. We also saw that women have less emergency support despite being worse affected in terms of the care burden for children and in terms of the unemployment statistics. Now, one of the peculiarities of the grant system was that in some cases, recipients of the CSG was disqualified from accessing other grants. And this led to some idiosyncrasies with respect to the impact of each of the grants on different groups, or when we split them in this instance by gender. We can also look further at these grants and look at what's happening in terms of peak coverage. We know that the grants, particularly the COVID grants, are expected to be phased out. And the damaging impact of this is particularly clear when we look at the NIDS-CRAM data, because we can see the impact of this peak grant coverage on how it's managed to mitigate the impacts of unemployment that have taken place due to COVID, right? So as people lose their jobs, they lose the ability to put food on the table, and the grants give them some form of assistance, be that only 350 Rand per month, which is the social relief of distress grant, right? Which is very low, but still is something that provides individuals with the ability to put at least some food on the table. So if these grants are phased out, which they will be in 2021, then we'll have a very negative welfare effect in South Africa. I just am going to show a very quick graph on hunger, because I know it will be spoken about a little bit more by Grace. We did see that despite the fact that by the fourth quarter of 2020, NIDS-CRAM was showing that employment was seeing a somewhat recovery, we were not seeing that same recovery in child hunger. And so the point was, even as our economy is adapting and there's all of this change in employment levels, lots of people losing jobs, other people gaining jobs, it was not improving our child hunger statistics. So another very interesting report that I reviewed in the course of NIDS-CRAM, which I want to summarize because it gives us an incredible insight into the spatial dimensions of the crisis, was just really how did this impact cities and metros, smaller suburbs and towns, informal areas and rural areas. And this is, I'm taking information here from Justin Fasaki and Ivan Turok's paper on the uneven geography of the crisis. What's really important to understand about grant recipiency in South Africa is how it's correlated with urban rural areas and also inside of cities with the suburban and with township areas. And this is where we were able to get a lot of insights as these people both received the grants, sometimes lost the grants, and then gave us their location so that we knew what was happening. And in summary, we saw that the pandemic magnified pre-existing divides between cities and rural areas on the one hand, and between suburbs and townships or informal settlements within cities on the other. The metros proved to be slightly more resilient to the initial economic shock than rural areas and cities and towns, and rural areas showed less signs and slower signs of recovery. When it came to social support, we saw that rural communities have been much bigger beneficiaries of government grants, and that this was very powerful in terms of improving the welfare in those communities. About 60% of people received social grants, and this compared with less than half in cities, towns, and in the metros. This was also partly because rural residents are far less likely to be in paid employment. So one thing that, a question that began to arise was, are rural recipients of grants in rural areas receiving too much support? Because there was some anecdotal evidence that things had never been so good for people in rural areas when they were receiving more than one kind of grant. And this led to a big discussion around targeting of social grants and how, if you have multiple different grants, then the targeting of your communities can sometimes be very tricky to be able to identify and discern when you're looking at receipts of grants. So what was very important was that we understood government grants were clearly helping to protect rural livelihoods and compensate these areas for weaker local economies and lack of jobs, but that they did also pose a risk when these relief or whenever the relief would be withdrawn. So that gives us a lot more nuance into the understanding of how grants, particularly additional support grants, impact upon the population. Now, similar points apply to differences within cities. So not just urban rural, we now focus on what happens between suburbs and between peri-urban respondents, which is what we would call where people live on the borders of cities and also then in townships. And once again, we saw that inequality was magnified here, right? And the implication is that government grants have definitely helped to offset unemployment and poverty in these townships and informal settlements. But very importantly, the premature withdrawal of social programs in these areas could lead to an exacerbation of hunger and extreme deprivation, not just for adults, but also for children, and for children who aren't attending school without getting regular access to meals. That's a disaster. Okay, so to sum up then, what we have been able to glean from the data is that the grants have played a saving role for millions of South African families, and therefore we do need to think of ways in which they can be sustained and how we will be able to pay for them. There is a case for more targeted efforts to boost jobs and livelihoods in urban and rural areas. And of course, we know that pre-existing conditions were bad enough, but there's further ground to make up. And that's where we really need to think about in terms of how we go forward. So where do we go from here? We know that the crucial change in 2020 was the rise in the number of grants and the number of grant recipients. And that really helped smooth out the welfare implications of the lockdowns. We do need to consider this idea of a universal basic income grant, but the question will be, does that then substitute for all other grants or not? In other words, does it mean that the CSG, the disability grants and others will all be phased out and only a universal basic income grant will be given? The fiscal policies needed to be able to afford this and evaluate its feasibility and sustainability would then be the next item on the agenda to interrogate. But we also need to start thinking about how do we increase livelihood opportunities. I'm pleased that one of the speakers today will be talking about expanded public works programs. There's a question about whether those are substitutes or complements for grants, and that we can pick up in the discussion. But when we think about the idea of livelihood opportunities, it's a different question to just increasing economic growth. Of course, we want to increase growth, but livelihood opportunities can often be diversified with or without growth taking place. And it's a form of redistributive social policy that, in my view, is somewhat underexplored and a key that needs to be addressed in our continuing response to the crisis. Finally, I would like to just talk about the importance then of thinking more broadly about these livelihood opportunities, because in places like peri-urban areas, in townships, in rural areas, each of these local geographies bring with them particular opportunities. We're increasingly becoming aware of how they interact with the environment, with waste, with health, how these things can be incorporated into expanded public works programs in order to better the local geographies at a micro level. So I'll end there and just want to give a final reminder to everyone on this webinar that the NIDS CRAM data is freely available to all individuals. There are reports on each of the themes I've discussed here today, which are on the website cramsurvey.org and freely downloadable at that website. So please do go ahead and interrogate all of those resources. Please also do email me with any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riza. I think that was incredibly informative, and I'm so pleased that we are just foregrounding the release of the next wave of NIDS data. I think the more people who access the data, the better our conversations and our choices and advice to policymakers can be. Before I welcome Shireen to talk exactly to the point, Riza, that you ended on in terms of livelihoods, I'd like to welcome Grace Bridgman, who has also been part of the NIDS CRAM. And Grace will be sharing some of the headline information on particularly hunger, because we know that hunger has devastating impacts in terms of development of children, well-being of people, and of course is completely, it fails to meet the constitutional right to dignity as well as the right to sufficient food and water. So Grace, if I can invite you now to share your screen and to share with us that information on hunger from the NIDS CRAM.
Thank you so much. I'll share my screen now. So just to reiterate, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. So my name is Grace. I've been part of the NIDS CRAM survey from the start. I was, just to give perhaps an interesting piece of information, I was part of a number of sort of 12, 13-hour Zoom calls thinking about the targeting and the survey instrument, and it really is an incredible collaboration to be part of. So I've been mostly involved in looking at questions on hunger in South Africa and the evolution of hunger and food insecurity in particular in South Africa in sort of the last year, looking at the NIDS CRAM data. So I'll be looking at two specific, I'm not going to take long, but two specific figures from wave 3, looking at household hunger. Now these are, this is the same graph that Riza presented earlier. Thank you, Riza. So I wanted to just highlight two figures. The first is that we have a large proportion of this country running out of money for food. So these red graphs over here show a respondent who answered yes to the question, did you run out of money to buy food in the last month? So comparable statistics from the GHS, which is another survey which can sort of give us an indication of lack of money for food, showed us that household hunger in the past year, in 2018, was around 25%. So for household hunger in the past month to be 47% in April is really a remarkable increase, and something that we should be worried about. But I wanted to also particularly draw attention to child hunger in November and December. So in the GHS, if we approximate child hunger in the past week. So the answer to this question, we got the 16% statistic based on the answer to the question, has a child experienced hunger in the past week? Now, for 16% of households to report, yes, a child has experienced hunger is also incredibly, it's really very sad. If you approximate the GHS, in 2018, around 8% of households were experiencing this. So within a year, this statistic has doubled. And this kind of demonstrates the urgency of this discussion. And it also highlights the need to think about how we are protecting the most vulnerable. And I think a discussion around grants and targeting is particularly pertinent. So in this paper, we also highlight the long-term impact of child hunger with particular reference to stunting. And another indication of malnutrition is the diversity of a child's diet. Now, for 41% of households to run out of money for food, I would suggest that the 59% who aren't running out of money for food are still decreasing the diversification of their diet, which can also be a problem. So to move on to the final sort of graph that I'll talk to. Now, you'll recognize this 41% from the last slide. That is the proportion of households who are running out of money for food. So it's very difficult to look at targeting of grants in NIDS-CRAM just because it's a telephonic survey, so we don't have access to all the information which we might like. Which means that we get to be creative as researchers. So to look at the targeting of different grants, we said, well, if 41% of households are going hungry or are running out of money for food, we would like targeting to be above. So if the grant is targeting the right household, more than 41% should be going to those households. Now, the best targeted grants were the CSG, and the old age pension. The old age pension is large, so it also is very good at pulling a household out of food poverty. But the SRD grant was also quite well targeted, not as well targeted as the child support grants. And I think if we're talking about child hunger, thinking about the targeting of the child support grant is particularly important. So I also just wanted to finally draw our attention to the accuracy of targeting of community support. Now, it's quite obvious that community support would be well targeted toward poorer communities, but I think that this points towards a larger question where it's not necessarily always the government who does the best job at targeting and knowing what people need. And it's part of a larger context and a larger conversation, but I think it was incredibly heartening to see community support being continually well targeted and continues. We find the same thing in Wave 4. But I think that this really agrees with Teresa around the importance of grants being well targeted, because communities are often alike, so they'll all be receiving a grant. But again, I'll pose the question of how we pay for them. I think any economist will think about how you would pay for them. So that's just some extra information from a researcher who's delved particularly deeply into hunger. Again, I think that child hunger is an incredibly large problem and will be for the next foreseeable future if we don't target child hunger in particular. And I hope that this adds some extra information for a very fruitful discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Grace, and thank you also for being so adaptable over the weekend in terms of the program. The graphic of the information of the grants and the levels is startling, and I think that one of the aspects that often happens when it comes to debates, policy debates, is that We sometimes start limiting our own information in a way that we think policymakers need to hear. So I would encourage us, as we have the rest of the discussion, not to limit ourselves thinking about how it's going to be paid for and who's going to pay for it, because we know that there are also conflicting views about what is affordable, and the choices that are made around both monetary and fiscal policy. So in this discussion, I would encourage people to see what needs to be done. And once we've seen the extent of what needs to be done, and the constitutional demands of what the state is obliged to do, we can start calling in people who are able to address the costing, monetary policy issues and fiscal policy. So thank you very much for that, Grace. I think I have been amazed at how little national debate is taking place around the levels of hunger. And if we're talking about a stimulus, if we're talking about recovery, and we're not even able to feed our children, how we expect there to be a greater recovery of the rest of society is something which is quite difficult to follow. And now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Shireen Matala. Shireen has been, as I said at the introduction, Shireen is the person who probably knows more than anyone else, apart from our common mutual friend, Anna McCord, who's now sitting in Sheffield, and who introduced me to Shireen as being a person who would be able to address us on this. Shireen, what I've always enjoyed about your ability to engage in this is that you don't dig in the trenches of either or, but you're able to emphasize, as Riza was concluding, questions on livelihoods and on the value of livelihoods as a way of multiplying so many dimensions of well-being. And so your time has been a little skewed, but don't worry, it is reserved. So as we, at 2:49, if you could speak till 10 past, and then each participant will be given a few minutes, each panelist will be given a few minutes just to respond to any of the other panelist inputs if they wish to, failing which we open up for quite a significant time of discussion. So thank you very much, Shireen, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I would consider myself the expert. I think there are many other people in the room who've got extensive experience. What I'm drawing on is work that myself and my colleague Stuart Ngando, unfortunately is not able to be here, have done empirical baseline work in KZN as well as nationally on EPWP. Yeah, so the presentation broadly covers these 4 areas. And I thought it was really important that we lock into what is this understanding of EPWP's envisaged contribution and what is the theory of change, because we often forget to unpack the design issues and how they relate to impact evaluations. And so I think we all know that there's an expectation. EPWP phase 3 and phase 4, very similar objectives, as you can see below here, about work opportunities, income support, labor-intensive delivery, and delivery of community assets and services. So there has been some change since the 2004 introduction of EPWP, which was very lofty outcomes of trained, capacitated people in the labor market, employment outcomes, etc. So those have been slightly tempered simply because the results haven't actually been able to provide any evidence that that's actually happened. So this is what's been expected as developmental impacts of EPWP. So wages are below market level. That's a very specific self-targeting mechanism, that there will be impacts from participation in work, skills building, employability, etc., and then impacts of the assets and services delivered, both in terms of the developmental outcomes, but also well-being outcomes for communities. And I'll talk to both those points broadly. A critical component of our work has been around reconstructing, and I'm using the word reconstructing very carefully because very few public interventions, and not just public employment programs, globally or even in South Africa, have actually unpacked theories of change. And theories of change are basically the defining of the pathways through which a particular set of outcomes and impacts are supposed to be realized, but importantly, the testing of the assumptions that underlie those. And so what we did, particularly, and we've done this for other studies, but I'm talking specifically to the Department of Environmental Affairs environmental impact study that we did, and the reconstruction of a theory of change there. So this might look like a very complicated diagram, but essentially the first column here speaks to what is the context that we're dealing with, then what are the inputs and activities that are implemented by that implementing agent. The outputs are what, unfortunately, what DPW and other institutions of Africa report as the outcomes, but they're not. They merely tell us how many people have actually been afforded work opportunities, what wage transfers there were, etc. They don't actually tell you in any meaningful way what the outcomes are. And increasingly, both with DPME's commitment to increasing evidence base, what was important was to begin to outline what are the outcomes, and we talked to both short and medium-term outcomes, and then ultimately what those impacts are. Policy documents from Department of Environmental Affairs, but also DPW. And then there's the assumptions, which are these little bubbles next to it, about what would work and what's underlying this particular pathway. So this all looks very nice, and the pathways look all very, not necessarily linear, but they're supposed to get you in a particular place. But there's a trilemma, and this is something that Michael Lewissing was actually the first person to kind of put a name to that. He used to be DG in DPW many, many years ago, and is now at the ILO. But that there are three sometimes conflicting, in fact, most times conflicting outcomes that public programs are expecting to achieve. Sustainable livelihoods, skills development, provision of assets and services. And the potential of those lie in the trade be synergized, except that there are significant trade-offs. And what we need to realize is that the labor intensity of public employment programs is enforced on departments who already have a set of outcomes that they have to deliver. So yes, they have to deliver on X number of environmental programs, X number of children in care or ECD, etc. And all they've done is to straitjacket that into an EPWP program where there's not a mismatch. And an example of that would be with the Department of Social Development, whose ECD, Early Childhood Development Program, had a subsidy transfer of 15 rands per child per month, per day, to an ECD center. But so that same program with that same funding formula was now transposed into becoming an EPWP program. Except that with those sorts of funds, you're not able to achieve the same kind of income targets. And therefore they had to top up grants, etc. So if you only use the income that would be achieved from EPWP, then your income per day for a participant might end up being something like 5 rands. Oh, apologies for that. Okay, so the skills trade-off as well. The department has to deliver on a particular objective of delivering services. There wasn't enough sufficient resources for skills development. And in a sense, that was just by the wayside. And most people, skills transfer doesn't happen occasionally. It happens over a period of time. And public employment programs have got very varying degrees of exposure. When I use the word exposure, how many days of work have you actually received? And so somebody with an average of 36 days or 76 days per year is not going to achieve that much of skills transfer than somebody who's perhaps in an Epwp or WOOF working on fire program, where you are going to have probably much more firefighters, etc. So we call this the intervention blind spot. And this is the, if you look at a typical log frame, the intervention blind spot is the expectation that these sets of activities here, under efficiency, etc., will realize these kinds of outcomes. And we know already, and I hope my evidence will show you that, in fact, that they don't. And it means that we've got to, we have to rethink the design, etc. And I did say, oh, you'll see, I was part of Epwp's phase 4 design with the ILO, and you might say, well, nothing's changed there. Unfortunately, that is the reality, that very little changed, simply because what we say and how what we've recommended doesn't necessarily get adopted because of all kinds of other imperatives. One of which was that we argued that work opportunities is an improper measure, an inappropriate measure of employment in South Africa, compared to, and also that the target of work opportunities does not do justice to the need for work, for employment. So FTEs, full-time equivalent work, being provided to people. I'm making certain assumptions about people's understandings of these concepts, so perhaps in the question time I'll be able to answer that. Although I say that the evidence is drawn from these 3 places, with looking at what I had this morning and amount of slides, etc., I decided to just focus largely on the Epwp, largely the DEAR study, largely because it was a national study, it was most recently implemented. I think there's a lot more evidence to speak to some of the challenges, but also the value of Epwp programs. So this is a little bit about the Epwp KZN program, very small sample size, etc. Whereas this is the final realized sample, which was statistically valid, and this is what's indicated here with a sorry, I'm just trying to move. I can't see parts of my screen here. Can you see it still? Is that all okay?
Yes, we can
Hello?
see.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Something's gone wrong here. All right. So essentially what we were saying was that there were 10 programs that we were evaluating across the country, all 9 provinces with gender stratification as well as race stratification. And then you have this margin of error that we achieved with the study. When I say sample size, we're talking about 400 projects as a sample size out of 1,200 projects. And then the population there is the participant population. So just for you to understand these figures here. All right, so what is the evidence telling us? I'm going to start talking to first the impacts for beneficiaries. The word participant beneficiaries is interchangeably used, but these are the workers, Epwp workers, both men and women. I haven't provided you details of the demographics, but our population was aligned to and almost mirrors the national employment in Epwp, national take-up in Epwp, which is predominantly female, younger youth, and yeah, that's and very low disability participation. So I just thought it's important that we begin to understand who. So there's a lot more demographic information I can give, but I haven't included all of that here. But one very important thing is understanding who are these participants and what is their education level. And as you can see, generally, you know, a lower level of education, and particularly people who started in the Epwp programs earlier, and the age, so above 36, again, lower education levels, etc. So that's the first thing that needs to be borne in mind. We asked a very important question because we needed to one of the other big problems with Epwp or any other public intervention programs is the blind spot of lack of baseline data. So you have to reconstruct this. And so we had to ask the question, what was your employment status before? And the good news is that if you look at those figures there, a very significant percentage of the workers had been unemployed prior to this program. So that's the male, female, and the total. And again, not unsurprisingly, a gendered outcome there of more women being unemployed than men, and an average of 77. We asked the other question about how many jobs had people participated in their lifetimes. Now, a job is a very ambiguous term in this instance, because people defined any work that they had done, and but this was, so some work could have been for a month, it could have been for a year, etc. And essentially, this is the picture that we got of people having worked. Most of them had reported working in EPWP, where they had got their first or second opportunity. So again, but generally very low employment levels. And then on average, the income that they reported on those previous jobs was 1,100 rands, which was quite lower, much lower than the DEAR EPWP average wage. So what was the monthly income, average monthly income from salaries and stipends for EPWP participants? The names on the side there are the 10 environmental programs. And the one that stands out there is the Working for Fire, because these participants, get a slightly higher stipend simply because of the danger levels, but also because of the exposure. The bridge might take 50 days to construct, or the participation of EPW might only be required for 50 days, whereas fire work requires the full year. And so greater exposure, slightly greater income levels. But overall, really concerning was the low levels of average monthly incomes, 1,941 rands, and males slightly higher. So the income, so this is this period between 2016 and 2018 when the evaluation was done, but the data was from 2012 to 2018. So it does have historical background as well. We've got more detailed breakdown of the income, but on average. We asked the question to the household. This is perception-based, self-reported feedback from participants about what they believed was the percentage of household income that the EPWP salary had contributed. And more than 50% reported that more than 50% of their gross income had more than 56, so which is slightly more than half of the participants reported that more than 50% of their income came from EPWP, which speaks to the demand or the call for basic income grant, the challenges that we've seen with the fact that the COVID grants was important. The lack of household incomes is a severe problem. And the results here, and the NIDS-CRAM results actually just highlights that again. This is very important. We asked people, what was your main source of income for that household? And so I've got a point about whilst working on the project and currently. This is important. I'll speak to that because over the 3 years, we ran a tracer study. So we asked people at the time that they were working, for those people who were working in 2016, and we went back to them between a year and 18 months later to ask them what their status was and what their income's earnings was. So this slide is quite important in terms of that child support grant remains quite an important source, although people who had subsequently exited the program, child support grants and pensions played a bigger role in their households, and then some other kinds of income where people were currently working. Just remember, if they were not working, then that figure didn't pertain. But this is how, so this is very little income diversification and very limited sources of income. So we asked the question, we did a poverty and assessment across the households to understand. So that was a full household expenditure profile, etc. Well, this is again self-reported. There's clear elements of error, etc. there. But broadly, and this is my colleague Stuart Ngando's work, etc., was to find that even with incomes transfers while working on environmental affairs, less than 50% of the households were living above the lower bound poverty line. So yes, transfers do have a place, they do make a contribution, but they are not about eradicating poverty, and they're not even bringing people up to the poverty line. So what were I'm moving on to the next slide because I'm mindful of our time and got a few more minutes left. So the food security outcomes, I've got 2 slides that speak to that. We found that again, household self-reporting was that the incidence of hunger in households improved due to participation. So to a great extent, by 52%, 43%, etc. Basically 64% of the sample, very small sample that we had indicated that working on the project had assisted in improving incidence for hunger, while 35% had greatly improved. And then this slide is a much more detailed one across it. And basically was we asked about whether there was food shortages in those households. And there are a number of other bits of analysis that we did regarding food shortages, etc. But essentially here you can see that food shortages persisted, some to a lesser degree than others, but it still persisted across the program. So this is the tracer study one. So we went to participants, sorry, not 1 to 5 years, 1 to 1.5 years after they had exited in 2013. And what we found was that of the sample that we had interviewed in 2016 who were working, 46% of those respondents, 55, we only managed to get 46 of them subsequently, 55% reported that they were now unemployed. So the exiting out of EPWP did not necessarily give them access into the, for a significant number of people did not give them access into the labor markets or any other income. Yeah. So this question was for those people who were currently employed. You know, when we did the tracer study, what we found was again that of the 45% who indicated they were temporarily employed, 38% were full-time employed, and 15% were employed part-time. And again, the gender statistics there for you. Again, I'm just going to go through that. We did so you can see we're comparing there between the unemployed, so those who are unemployed, and then those who are self-employed, unemployed, and you can see the figures there, etc. So this is now again the poverty outcomes. And again, it's an analysis of the participants and what their status was post. And for those who were currently working on a project, who were working on a DEAR project, this is what they reported in relation to their poverty levels. For these were people who were unemployed post participation. These were people who were employed, but not in an EPWP job, in some other job. And then these were another EPWP job, but not in DEAR, in another department. But again, overall, you can see that in terms of the prevalence, which is the green line, the depth of poverty and the severity of poverty. We're looking at high levels there as well. And again, poverty levels for women, depth, severity, etc., are higher than those for men. This was the gross. So I did speak to the gross monthly income.
Doreen, sorry, just to come in, if you could wrap up in a minute or two.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to go to the last one. So this was a very, very quick analysis, a very short analysis that we did of what is the livelihoods benefits of the actual services and benefits that were delivered to communities. And essentially what we found was that it had contributed to household survival by providing food, nutrition, etc. in those particular households. But I'm going to rush through that very quickly. So just in conclusion then, the realized sample in DEAR is meaningful enough to draw certain conclusions. The overall conclusion is that, yes, it does have a socioeconomic objective of mitigating severe poverty, but it is not eradicating vulnerability and poverty completely, and that the impacts are stronger if you are participating longer. And there's very limited evidence, less than 16% reported labor market access, and almost no training outcomes in terms of employment. And I think the last point I'd like to make then is that we found that none of those outcomes were sustained post-exit from EPWP. So thank you very much.
you very much, and thank you also for being so gracious in wrapping up. I like the term trilemma, and it seems to be that this has been something which EPWP has always been susceptible to, and those were your concluding points about what it is able to do, what it's not able to do. I trust our messages that we'll be able to take through to policymakers as we sit with the recently communicated decision not to extend the social relief of distress. And I know that there are many participants who are here who are going to be able to and willing and eager to engage in that kind of discussion. I would just like to ask which of the panelists, so that's Riza, Grace and Shireen, would like to respond to either of the other two panelists. And Nadia's just reminded me to remind people who do speak to please put your camera on. We sadly don't have time for thorough introductions, but so Riza, would you, maybe I should just call your name and then you're able to have 3 minutes, and if you don't wish to avail yourself of that, you can just say pass. Riza, over to you. Would you like to discuss any of the points raised by your co-panelists?
Sure, I'll be more than happy to do so. Let me just start my video. Thanks. I don't have much to add. There's a lot with expanded public works programs that we have to think carefully about. They include the question to train individuals in a set of skills that can be recognized in the market post the expanded public works program. And this is where there has been a lot of challenges as far as I recall. I don't stay on top of this literature. And so I think it would be great if Shireen could perhaps reflect on this. I think there was a few stats in the presentation and I missed I missed some of them. But I think that's one of the key things. How is training able to increase the marketability or employability of the participants in EPWP post the program? That's the first. The second thing that I did actually want to draw some attention to is the fact that the Department of Environmental Affairs and several other departments are doing EPWP programs is really quite understudied in South Africa, in my view. I think, it's great to see this kind of data coming out because what we're increasingly seeing is that when something like an EPWP comes out, if they're paying individuals into digital wallets, for example, very frequently the unintended positive benefits of the EPWP is to start bringing people into a formal banking system for those who are not already in there. So when I know, for example, in the past with waste collection efforts that were run by DEER, often the third parties, institutions who were running these would pay waste pickers in townships, for example, through an e-wallet. And many of those individuals would not have bank accounts. And so it would introduce them to come into the formal financial system. And it had all of these kinds of positive externalities that weren't accurately captured by a normal monitoring and evaluation study. And as we move towards trying to understand the impacts of EPWPs and how we try to think about how can we really provide relief in places like townships, which are the most economically depressed in our society, we really do have to start thinking about that, because the technology that can be utilized nowadays to start benefiting the community, keeping money in those communities, and getting involved with the individuals there to form cooperatives. All of these types of indicators are frequently not in the M&E reports that we see. Yet, I personally have experience where I saw these things happening, and my view is that they were tremendous livelihood creation strategies, very frequently underreported. Often we would see the sort of cash inflows and outflows to individuals and judge the success of the EPWP on that basis, whereas it was just not the case that that was the only benefit. You were getting benefits from participation in these things, from training programs, from digital payment systems, and the infrastructure needed to set up a digital payment system. Often these digital payment systems were based on biometric data, so you were able to then link the biometric data of the participant, with other information, and as a consequence, they could use that to open bank accounts. And I would like to ask Shireen to perhaps reflect on whether she has seen more literature on those kinds of outcomes through these EPWPs, because frequently we can assess them to be, short-term and not perhaps giving the benefits we'd hoped. But in my own experience, I have seen some incredibly successful EPWPs doing very cool things with digital payments and other kinds of innovations that have really helped poor communities. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Riza. I think the question of multipliers is definitely an indication of an ongoing conversation that needs to be had. Grace, I'm going to ask you if you would like to respond to either of the co-panelists briefly.
I don't have anything particular to add, except to reflect again on what you said after I spoke, in saying that it's always important to come back to need, and just in being a researcher who's engaged with the statistics on what is needed, it's clear that support for vulnerable is indeed sort of pertinent to think about.
Thank you. And thanks for giving us a bit more of your time. Shireen, Riza asked you some quite specific questions, and I would like to encourage you to answer those offline maybe, but just as the last panelist, as people start talking about the policy responses needed to address the levels of poverty, your final reflections would be welcome.
Thank you. I just wanted to make one particular, I'm completely not in tandem with what the presentations were made, and I think they resonate with the evidence that we know is out there. It's just very interesting that when the lockdown happened, one of the things that the then minister did was she instructed EPWP across the country that anybody who was a current participant, even if they're not working any longer, should continue to get their money, which is a great thing because at least they were getting an income. We tried to encourage that. There were lots of contracts that were coming to an end, so people would not necessarily get money if they were no longer on the program. But they literally might have just exited 2 weeks or a month ago. But unfortunately, that was not successful. I think I want to just very quickly respond to the 3 points that were made. Well, 3 points that I noted. So in relation to, and I'll be quite brief, but in relation to training, yes, we did an extensive amount of work around training, and what we found was a mismatch between what the market needs and what training was provided. So, for example, working for fire workers have developed extensive skills that ESCOM and Translate, etc., could use, which is occupational health and safety, trained people, as well as people who could work in high altitude. So working with all these heavy duty equipment, etc. Unfortunately, the problem was that those programs were not accredited, and so then ESCOM and Translate, etc., could not employ people. So this is the kind of mismatch that we saw. Also, short-term training, so a 5-day or a 10-day training for EPWP primary healthcare workers or emergency. So when they were working as home-based care workers. Was completely inadequate for the kind of qualification. So basically what we saw was in the EPWP study we did in KZN, we found 15% of the 15 to 16% of the social sector participants got jobs, not brilliant jobs in terms of income levels, but as cleaners in hospitals or as a cleaner in ECD center as a direct result of that. So yes, so there are a lot of questions, but there were lots of recommendations that we made about training. On the issues around the multipliers, so in the KZN study, one of the things that we did was to do observation visits. And I went to a community in the South Coast, And on the day in which Epwp participants were being paid, you would see a whole lot of, at the pay center in the town, so this is in Tualume, you would see, not in Tualume, in Zinto, you would see a whole lot of service providers who had all driven up from Shepstone and from Durban, and who were selling all kinds of services to people. So that little community near High Flats had a substantial income. If you look at Community Works program, 1,000 people getting 500 rands a month, that's a R500,000 investment to that community. But on that same day, a whole lot of that money flew out of the community back to Durban, and was not, and we discussed that with the local community, trying to understand why that was the case. And it is basically a problem about the lack of local economic development opportunities and market spaces, etc., and opportunities. On the other hand, the local jet shop or the local supermarket actually reported having to employ more people because people had incomes. We had a little case study, for example, of somebody who was a mender. He was a tool handy person who would repair equipment, and he suddenly started to get more work because people wanted their irons repaired or their stove repaired, etc. So they definite multipliers like that. We weren't able to track those fully, but those kinds of impacts were there and could be perceived. The issue around the bank, yes, absolutely. We noted extensively higher levels of banking because of the system required it. Regrettably, at the time that we did the study, electronic bank, there was no use of electronic data by sort of cell phone data, etc. for logging in people's participation and then payments through that. It was all through bank accounts. And so many of the participants in rural areas, for example, right down in the Karoo, etc., were complaining that the cost for them to get to a bank or post bank, etc., to get their money was a significant problem. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. I think the question of multipliers is definitely something which we get told by National Treasury that there is no multiplier benefit. And so this kind of evidence, both anecdotal but also increasingly recorded, would be extremely useful on a variety of dimensions. So I have asked people a couple of occasions, if you do have questions and answers, to please pop those into the Q&A channel. And I see we have one. Just to say to people that we have until about just before 4 in order for you to raise your questions to the panelists and possibly test some of your own opinions against the data that is out there. So please do. And I know that there is also the possibility through the streaming Facebook of raising your questions. But I'm just going to quickly read. This is a question to Shireen. It's from Caroline O'Reilly, who asks that you noted you are excluding Community Works program from the presentation, which was a very interesting one. Is that because you haven't been involved in evaluations of it, or because the impacts of those participants differ significantly from those of the Epwp participants? Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you. Should I respond to that now, or do you want to go ahead?
No, please. It's the only one at the moment, so it's your. Shireen, I think you have just frozen. Any technical advice to Shireen about unfreezing?
I would advise that she turns off her webcam because it seems as if there's an internet connectivity problem. So yes, but I doubt whether she can hear me.
Okay, Shireen, there we go. I think let's just keep our responses without the video. And if you are still with us, There is another question for Shireen as well, as she rejoins us. I'm really hoping you're rejoining us, Shireen, by Takunda Satumba. And Shireen is back. So Shireen, do you want to respond to Caroline's on the CWP, and then I will raise Takunda, or you might advise it you're able to read and respond at the same time, whichever you prefer.
I'm sorry. Okay, I apologize. I don't know what happened there, but I got kicked off. So I was saying that particularly with, so with CWP, yes, I have done a small study with CWP, but I was much more involved with the CWP assessment that we did for phase 4. And CWP had definitely a large number more participants in communities benefiting, multiple people from households, which also has its own value. In some households, there was value in that because it was crowding in incomes. And the design of CWP, which was significantly different from the way in which EPWP, meant that the communities identified who the beneficiaries were, and it appeared to have less leakage than the patronage systems of EPWP in some of the communities that we found with councillors, etc. However, the problems with CWP post the transfer of CWP to COCTA have been significant. And so our findings were that unless CWP was moved out of, well, for one, there was a huge problem about why they did this fragmentation when they are the same program, when they are essentially part of the EPWP pool, that they should not actually be separated. That's the one. The second is that the levels of corruption was so high. It was way higher than any of the other departments had reported, including ghost opportunities of almost 40,000 people who was 40,000 opportunities that Treasury was not able to find in one particular year, etc. So there's been a litany of problems with the way in which CWP has been evaluated. I could give a lot more detail about that, but I'm just worried about time. So I think I'm going to be guided by you, Isabel.
Thanks, Shireen. I think maybe we could revert to that in the tie-up. There is another question to you. I'm just interested in the issues around corruption because that is something that needs to be factored in. Takunda's question is really, in essence, asking if the training benefits are low and employment is not permanent, leaving participants always uncertain whether they'll be employed in another project or not, and hunger is looming. How can the design of the program be improved or changed so that this social protection program can provide substantial and sustainable impact on participants? I think, Takunda, that's really asking and answering a different question, which is EPWP a form of social protection, which is one of the issues that Shireen spoke to. So I'm going to just, Shireen, I'm going to move on to another question to Riza or Grace. And then in the wrap up, it's one of the ones that maybe you could come back to. Catherine Hall asks the question to Riza or Grace: how strong is the evidence on the protective role of the older persons grant? It is a large grant and received a top-up bonus. One would think that these households would be least likely to have experienced severe economic shock and lockdown, like a best case scenario for social assistance. And how do we see that playing out in relative household food security, child hunger, etc.? So Riza or Grace, please proceed to answer.
Okay, I'm happy for both of us to answer, and Grace can answer as she sees fit. In my view, to answer that question precisely, what we would need to do is we would need to look at recipiency of each grant and map that to the incidence of hunger in order to say, did those who got larger grants and were perhaps in stable states, in this instance, those who are retired, for example, they would be least likely to have been negatively affected by the lockdowns. And so as a consequence of that, should have gained more. But we would want to look at those in terms of as much of the household incidence figures that we could get to. And off the top of my head, I couldn't answer that. So perhaps, Grace, if you've done any work on identifying hunger by each of the recipients or by each grant, and the relative impacts of grant recipiency on hunger, please go ahead and let us know about that outcome. Thanks.
Thanks, Grace. Are you wanting to come in there? Okay, that might be the moment that Grace went to get a cup of tea. So you are going to be invited, Grace, towards the end to speak, but we're just moving on. Mandy Smallhorn asks whether anyone is doing any analysis of NGO feeding schemes and the like. Possibly that could be responded to in the chat section. Shireen, so can I ask you to go back to Takunda's question and really answer as to, do you think that EPWP is a social protection scheme? And then the second question to you again, Shireen, from Timothy Kola is whether you have any thoughts on the Department of Basic Education's Basic Education Employment Initiative, one of the largest public employment programs to date, which recently came to an end, but believe an extension is under consideration. So on those two questions, please, if you may respond, Shireen.
Sorry, just remind me about the first question again. The sound is a little bit...
The first question, without my severe editing, is basically if EPWP is to develop participants and the training benefits are low, the employment is not permanent, and hunger is looming at all times on participants, how can the design of the program be improved and changed so that this social protection program can provide substantial and sustainable impact on participants? So my question is, could you respond to that as in, is this an appropriate social protection program?
Yes, so I think our conclusion is that it is an effective social protection program. However, this idea that every single departmental's work is lends itself to labor-intensive work is a serious problem because of the particular kinds of skills and the particular kinds of exposure. So when infrastructure programs are largely designed around a set number of days, and after that, that's it. You're 50 days and then you're out there. It's not providing. The key thing is that the design should be similar to what CWP is achieving and what NREGA has done in India, which is sustained access to regular sources of income and for as long as people need it. So this idea in provincial departments that we want to exit people in order to allow other people to come into the program. All you're doing is recycling poverty. You just, now in one group of poor people to come in for 2 years and then they get kicked out and others go out. So one of the design features is regular, consistent employment. So CWB type design, that's the first. The second is re-evaluate quite significantly which programs in government lend themselves to. So working for fire, yes, it does lend itself to. Early childhood development, again, lends itself to. School programs, etc. would. But there are other programs that are not well suited. We found that the programs working with them, the cost, we did a cost benefit analysis, which I didn't even present with you, on the DEAR program and the KZN program, etc. And it was worrying because to try and employ one person for mining program, the costs were exorbitant and the value was almost negligible. There was very little output in terms of jobs created, or in the FTEs was zero in some of those programs. So again, definitely working towards FTE equivalence. The issue around training, we believe that there is significant potential for training that is aligned to what the industry and the market needs. So like, for example, with the environmental affairs, the working for fire training is not accredited. Most of the modules are not accredited simply because they have not been yet registered with the SAQA, which is quite a concerning issue. So many of these people have got the training, have got the competencies, but cannot get jobs in ambulances or in firefighting departments, et cetera, even though they've got strong occupational health and safety, although many of the occupational health and safety people could possibly but there wasn't enough effort around training significant numbers because they weren't able to get enough bursaries or grants for people to study. When EPWP in phase 1 and phase 2 had a strong link to EPW, to training, accredited training, almost 58% of all the women who participated in ECD in the Western Cape had received, in EPWP, had received accredited training. So the design issues have to be much more tightly developed, addressed.
Thank you, Shireen. If you could conclude at this stage with Timothy's question about whether you have any thoughts on DBE's basic education employment, then I've got a question from Julian and one from Neil. So all seem to be directed at you right now, Shireen.
Okay, so I'm currently involved, or as HSRC, we're involved in one of those projects where 1,000 participants are going to be working with HSRC on some data collection stuff, etc., and community-based data collection on COVID. So I know about the DBE program, but I don't know the details of it. I think that irrespective of whether the idea behind these kinds of programs is good. The problem is when it's for 6 months or very limited time. Also the targeting, because what we found was that even with the DEAR, EPWP and KZN, the dropout rates were very high because many youth, for example, were saying, this is not cool work. This is not work that I'm interested in doing. This is very labor intensive. So people who were doing gardening work or landscaping were complaining, whereas others who wanted to be in behind the desk perhaps would find better alignment. So definitely we're feeling that yes, it does have value. We think it has value both for the schooling community as well as for participants. But again, design features, transfer rates, etc., all are important issues.
Thank you. Julian, would you like to ask your question and open your camera? There we go.
Yes, sure. So I think my question is to all three panelists. You've presented evidence essentially on one option to deal with our current crisis, and that is various forms of social grants. And you've also heard evidence about the ability of a public works program to deliver poverty, a reduction in poverty. Now, given that Grace's discussion on the levels of hunger and particularly the levels of child hunger, and given that in the year or so that we've been under the impact of COVID and the lockdown measures, and that in that year, I guess about 1 million children have been conceived, and something like possibly up to 40% have experienced a quite severe nutritional shock, either directly or while they were in the womb. So given the evidence you've heard, is there anything that you see that convinces you that the response should be anything other than a cash grant? So was there any evidence that you saw in the presentations that makes you concerned that we have alternatives and that we are not exploiting those alternatives and maybe too readily going to providing cash? I hope that
Thank you.
question's clear.
I see that is an incredibly astute question, but you are bringing chaos into this forum, which is something to be embraced, I believe. But I see Riza has a hand, although the question was really to broader participants. So Riza, you will get a chance. I just want to know, while people think about that, Neil's question to Shireen is about wage levels. So basically, as participants, you're being instructed to think very quickly and very carefully about Julian's question, while Shireen is being instructed or requested to respond to Neil's question, and then Riza will be given a speaking opportunity. So Neil asks Shireen, on wage levels, the President's employment stimulus has pegged the wage at 3.5 per month. Your comment on how this should impact on the EPWP. Second question is your point on sustainability or long-term nature of programs. Doesn't this talk to the difference between the design of EPWP and community works program? So if you are able, Shireen, to give initial responses, possibly something you can take offline in a follow-up conversation with Bill. But please proceed with what strikes you immediately, specifically on the wage levels.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you. That's a really valuable question. So at the time that the Minimum Wage Commission was doing its work, we actually engaged with Imran Valodia and his team because of what would then be the minimum wage for EPWP, because it was pegged at a particular rate. And it was now going to be about 700 to 800 rands less than what the minimum wage was. And we raised that as a serious concern, because already in communities with different types of EPWP program, there were protests when the transport, when the infrastructure's EPWP was paying higher rates because there was not at a particular stage an equal rate across all EPWP programs. It created havoc. So that's the first part. The second is that we would want to argue that it should have been, EPWP should be pegged at least something around the minimum wage, simply because of the scale of unemployment and the scale of poverty that we have here. And that we didn't think that they would have a huge displacement effect, because that was what was being raised by the department in terms of why it should not be at a particular level. So that's my point on that. On the sustainability issues, the difference in design in EPWP and CWP is definitely a fundamental problem, where CWP is about consistent access to regular sources of income. We found evidence of people being able to save, being able to buy in bulk, which they cannot do with EPWP. We found evidence of asset accumulation, which is very, very low levels of saving, very low levels of asset accumulation, but significantly better for CWP or people with longer dosage. So you're working for fire, more opportunities for small amounts they put a VIP toilet in their home. They added an extra room for rental, etc. Small little things that they could do, which the others could not do. So very much. And I think that the Narega, the India example, which is what CWP is designed along, again confirms that this is an important design issue, regular sources of income, but also community designed and community monitored programs. A lot of corruption in CWP was because of the fact that Calcutta did not follow through on those design principles. But in the initial stages, when I first worked on the program, when Kate was involved with it, it had significant benefits in terms of making sure that communities would identify who were the poorest in that community that needed these if you only had 100 jobs, etc. Yeah, let me just stop there. May I talk to the point that Julian's raising?
Please. This will be your wrap-up point, and we look forward to hearing.
Okay, so sorry, I'm not. Is the question in the chat or in the Q&A? I'm just trying to.
It is in the chat.
Oh, it's in the chat. Okay, because I just wanted to quickly go through it again, or if you could just.
Oh no, sorry. Julian's question or Neil's question?
No, Julian's question was.
No, he asked that. So basically, is there any policy intervention that hasn't been considered in this meeting that you think, with your evidence and insights from the field, we need to consider in South Africa right now?
I think that there have been a number of policy recommendations, including from the National Planning Commission recently, around 2019, and there have been other recommendations around changing the nature of EPWP to be more long-term, not this removing the exit strategies, etc. But the broader question that I thought Julian was raising was, what's the trade-off between giving a grant to somebody, giving a cash benefit compared to a social protection benefit such as this, which is mediated through a government department. When we did a comparison of outcomes, household outcomes when they had cash transfers as opposed to food parcels. And we did that for KZN, where some participants, EPWP, were getting food parcels, others were getting cash benefits. This was in 2014, when it was actually already NEDLAC had made a decision to outlaw, to stop that practice. We found that there were better outcomes for households, both in terms of their nutritional levels as well as their income levels, when they had the cash transfer as opposed to a food parcel. There's a lot of money that's going through middlemen, and so we think that overall, I think there's a problem with government, and the government's not going to be happy to give young, adult, able-bodied people large amounts of money. They're not comfortable about that. We know that already. So they want to give only the so-called vulnerable, and we've seen that even with what happened with the COVID grant, etc. But ideally, if we had a basic income grant, some kind of unemployment support program for young people, we don't believe that necessarily will become an incentive for work. For increasing the number of people who are discouraged from work. We don't think so, because we didn't see any evidence of that. Where people were working on EPWP, they were still trying to earn other incomes on the side, in other activities in the weekends. There was one very entrepreneurial young man who collected the money over 6 months, got himself one of these video equipment things, and was now running a disco every weekend in his community, and had reported that he was able to start saving for his education. So I think there are significant debates and questions about which and how we spend our money. But yeah, the problem with EPWP or public employment is that governments are not being able to scale it up at all. We haven't gone beyond 1 million people. And look at grants, look at the access and the extent to which grants have benefited households.
And the ability to include people, as Riza was saying, I think you've touched on the point about the ideological opposition to giving people money. And just Riza, before I open to you, there was a similar example in the Namibian basic income grant pilot where I went, where someone was able to show in those days DVDs to the community and charge people entrance. So we can see how assets are purchased and used to generate further income. That's my completely unbiased view, Julian. Riza, you've had your hand up and you've been very patient. Please take the floor.
Thanks for the opportunity. And no, I think the answers that have been given by Shireen are excellent with respect to the EPWP side. I'd like to just provide an answer with respect to children. So one of the things that we do know, Julian, is that one of the tragedies of the lockdown period has been that despite an increase in cash grants, school feeding schemes, both at the primary and secondary school level and at ECD centers, those school feeding schemes have dramatically fallen in terms of their delivery of food and their efficacy, because kids have not been going to school, they haven't received the food parcels. Now, one of the dreadful consequences of that is that we know from James Heckman's work on early childhood development that if kids are not getting, especially in early parts of life, where some ECD centers will be focusing, they're not getting regular nutrition of the right quality, then their cognitive skills are affected and their non-cognitive skills are affected. And one of the great tragedies and potential long-term implications of our education policy during lockdown, by having things like school closures, is that we have had a material nutritional impact upon the most vulnerable, which is children. So one of the things I'd like to put into the public domain is attention. And in NIDSCRAM, we've done this repeatedly because there's a big community of scholars on schooling, education, and ECD. We've published papers on this, and on Wednesday, we're going to give the latest updates on child hunger when we release wave 4 of NIDSCRAM. One of the biggest implications has been also the reduction in learning because of closed schools. So in future, given the fact that we know that the severity of these types of pandemics are going to increase in frequency, all public health and epidemiological studies are suggesting that that's what's going to be trending in the world from a public health point of view in future. Our response to them and what we learn from COVID lockdowns has to be very, very rigorously interrogated, because my view is that what's happened at the level of education has just been an exacerbation, not just of educational inequality, but also of the kinds of nutritional outcomes that government worked really hard to set up, and which by all accounts was on average very successful, which is school feeding schemes. Those in fact have been very negatively affected. Whatever we do going forward, however many lockdowns we go into, the interrogation of the relationship between schooling and feeding and early childhood development outcomes must be prioritized, because I don't think we did a great job of that this time around. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reza. And it's something which we raised at NEDLAC repeatedly with the Department of Education not wanting to take on board any of the learnings globally about the bag and grab. So that is an area which requires urgent attention. Grace, would you like to say anything in wrap up? And then I am going to invite Himla back to wrap up and give the official thanks. But Grace, the floor is yours. And the question is hunger.
Thank you. I think that perhaps being a slightly more conservative economist, I'm aware that nothing happens in a vacuum, and child hunger will have consequences for, some would say, the next 60 years, hunger that's experienced now, especially in developmental stages. But there's also a need to protect children who are coming in terms of having a functional economy with food in the shops, and that the larger context always needs to be taken back. Economists would see this as sort of a general equilibrium sort of thought process, but I won't give any more input. I'm aware of the time, and thank you all for.
Thank you very much. Himla, can I ask you to, I just want to say from my side, thank you to everybody. This has been absolutely far more fruitful than I could have hoped for, and it's been very challenging to a number of assumptions that I was carrying. So thank you again, and to the panelists for being so quick and ready to volunteer your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel, and firstly, thanks to you for moderating the session, and to Reza, Grace, and Shireen for their input on the various aspects that they brought to our attention. I must say I'm not a specialist in this area, and for part of the discussion, I was Googling some of the acronyms used, since I'm not so familiar with the terminology, etc. But having done that, I must say that the content of the discussion was quite complex and reinforced the necessity for evidence-based studies in prioritizing these discussions. And I want to congratulate all the panelists for doing just that. I mean, Reza brought to our attention the NIDS-CRAM publications, and while those are all available, not every one of us engage with it. So I liked how he juxtapositioned what was going on from the studies that had started from 2008 to 2017, and how that was unpacked during the different phases of lockdown, and the kind of correlation between the levels of lockdown and that of unemployment and the poverty types of issue. It is quite interesting that at the height of lockdown level 5, during the second quarter of the financial period, that our economy shrunk by 12%. And while these are the numbers, we are all aware of people in our circles who have suffered as a consequence of lack of employment and the bottleneck and squeeze with their income and how this has manifested through their livelihoods, etc. And I am looking forward to the release of the fourth in the series of the NITSCRAM report, and I'm sure we will be engaging with that next week. I also wanted to acknowledge the points that were raised by possibly all three speakers, and that's the crisis to the vulnerable with respect to the school-going individuals. That has been stressed in many a conversation that we've had, and to hear how that really unpacked with the studies that have been conducted by these colleagues is again an eye-opener of how vulnerable the system is, and that we need to redress the issues in the schools with the school feeding and the inequalities that exist in the public school and the private school sector with access to education and to other means to kind of promote education among all, leaving no one behind. The issues of hunger, Grace, I mean, really brings to the fore that we just take so much for granted. Even during your presentation, I was having a cup of coffee, and then I felt so guilty having my coffee with my Mari biscuits next to me and thinking about those who don't have much by way of their plight in the macro environment of society. So we understand these problems, and we also are aware of the Sustainable Development Goals 1 related to poverty. And we should not forget that while we focus on all the important issues going on around us, that as a country, we are still in line to deliver on our Sustainable Development Goals. And I would hope that at some point there'd be a kind of merging of these studies against that backdrop. I suppose you all are doing it, but just didn't stress that at the moment. Shireen's point of whether a cash benefit is better, or what is the cash benefit versus transfer of food parcels, etc. How do we assess this? How do we know that the funds that have been earmarked for the child support grant and others, albeit under 500 Rand each, has gone towards the deed for which it was assigned? And how do we assess that? So I'd be interested to see in forthcoming reports how all of this has gone on. We've also heard about the average income of under 2,000 per family household and the discrepancies in the income between males and females in all of this, with women bringing in much less, even though they have much more of the responsibilities of engaging the household and all the household activities. So I guess we are not done with this, and we will learn more from the respective panelists. And I've noticed that many of the participants who have joined us today are also experts in some areas of this work, and also serve on the Poverty and Inequality Committee. So I thank you for your input. Colleagues, in closing, I just want to add that this is the first of a series of webinars. In a month's time, we plan to hold another one, and that topic is how to fund potential poverty and inequality reduction interventions. And the third one in the series is related to what must be done to make the state capable of poverty and inequality reduction. So look out for these postings. My colleague Nadia, together with the committee, will put out the necessary notices in due course. So it lastly leaves me once again to thank all of you for your participation, for your questions, and for engaging the panelists, to the panelists for giving of their time unstintingly for the last 2 hours in guiding a very difficult but rather well presented evidence-based presentations. So I thank you very much, and also to the ASSAf staff who have been working in supporting Nadia with this. Thank you also for managing the Facebook profile and for assisting us with a few hiccups technically that we had at the beginning. Thank you all, and thanks also to Julian May, who chairs this committee, and we look forward to your continued support and insights going forward. Thanks very much, Isabel. Julian, perhaps you want to just say a few words at the end. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I think we've said everything that's important, Himla, but in particular, just to re-emphasize what came up often today was how will we pay for it? And that is the topic of the next webinar. Thank you.
Julian, you're very good at marketing for an academic. So thank you everybody for being part of this, and have a good evening.